Thank you. Thanks for inviting us, and thanks for the introduction. So today, as Pat was saying, we're going to be discussing an environmental concern that's gaining increasing attention in the public sphere and in policy spaces, and of course the scientific community on plastics and their environmental impacts. And I made a slight title change just because of the focus is still marine plastic crisis, but I added a critical sustainability science approach to leave out the question, but and we'll explain why as it goes on. So we'll try to briefly explain what we as social scientists can bring to this discussion of a marine plastic crisis. We are very aware and pleased with the work in the natural and technological science that have been leading the way on these matters. Today, we are going to talk about these as social concerns because we argue that they're essentially social in their origin and they arise from social structural forces and their dynamics. So these are social processes and activities, right? So just for some reason this is off, a bit of background that most of you are probably very familiar with or somewhat familiar with, but nevertheless it's useful to provide an overview. So the global plastic crisis is characterized by massive production, pollution, and persistence of plastics in the environment, and is affecting many Earth systems, including, of course, marine systems. So the production and consumption of plastics are having negative consequences for human health and the health of many organisms on the planet. It's also, of course, contributing to the carbon footprint of the climate crisis. So there are significant aspects of several ecological concerns, as we'll talk about. So it should be made clear also that every stage of the process, from production to consumption to disposal of plastics, is having deleterious impacts on humans and the rest of nature. So there are multiple and interrelated environmental crises here, and they can be understood as, we argue, and we're suggesting here, manifestations of deeper socio-ecological dynamics. And that's the key here. And highlights that plastic problem and the plastic crisis is not an isolated issue, for example, of waste management, but a symptom of broader social relations and processes and institutional conditions, right? So, and just on, say, a positive note here, it's important to note that the simple fact that these are social conditions and that they're human creations, and therefore they are changeable. So these social processes and institutional conditions are human-created processes that are changeable, of course. So plastic pollution in the ocean has become one of the major issues and areas of focus in this larger plastic crisis. It's highly visible materially, but also in the scientific discourse and the public debates. The accumulation of plastic debris, ranging from the largest big pieces to the microplastics, has been extensively studied and has led to great advancements in identifying sources and tracking pollution across marine ecosystems, also modeling this in various places, the transport of an accumulation in the deep sea, for example, or in coastal areas. So this research has provided this very rich, detailed insight into fragmentation and bioaccumulation and ecological impacts of plastic, the plastic crisis, and bringing up great concerns about biodiversity loss and food web disruptions, and also, of course, the risks to human health. So these scientific efforts have been instrumental in shaping policies aimed at addressing plastic waste, and also the potential and discussions and developments of international agreements and certain bans on on plastics, such as plastic bags and things like that. So it's been a very productive and important area of research. So lately, as I was talking before everyone arrived, we began to develop social research on these matters, publishing on the historical development of plastics and what we call the growth of the synthetic age, discussing the ways that the growth of plastics was directly associated with historically situated social forces and imperatives, such as the search for raw materials and that had certain characteristics. For example, we discuss the need for changes in production time and increasing that rate of production time, the search for moldable, accessible, durable, inert, and lightweight products that was driving this related to the production after the Second World War, as well as the needs and demands that arose with further development of modern, what we call the social metabolic order. And that includes, for example, this a high capital to labor ratio, that where these kinds of materials could be substituted for labor time, right, and work time, because they can be mass produced and such. So we use this term social metabolism, for example, to refer to the historically specific ways in which societies develop systems of production and consumptions. That is the socio-ecological processes of exchange of matter and energy between human social systems and the rest of nature. And we do this, of course, in order to maintain and reproduce societies. So we've been engaging in this kind of developing analytical approaches and theoretical discussions about society and nature relations, and plastics is a very good case study for understanding the benefits of our approach. And we have initiated a project here at GU, which is further examining these concerns in the European context. So just a little how we've gotten into this subject, but just a little bit of background. We've been writing and developing this analytical approach in several papers, ultimately making the case for what I'm calling a critical sustainability science to advance research on global environmental change, you could say. So we draw heavily on me being a sociologist, environmental sociology, and also ecological economics and other social sciences to develop what we think is an interdisciplinary historical and materialist framework that we feel can advance an integrative socio-ecological analysis. In that sense, we very much engage and take seriously the work of the natural sciences and integrating this into our approach and understanding of these social factors. So in this regard, what we suggest is we're not simply developing a cultural analysis, we're developing an integrative analysis, and that's what the materialist framework is about. We could discuss that more if you like. So we'll briefly discuss the implications of this later when Borja talks. I just wanted to introduce that we draw on various approaches in the social sciences to do this, including the treadmill of production, the tragedy of the commodity, social metabolism, as I said, and degrowth. We'll talk a little bit about all these in developing this research program in critical sustainability science. So we think that it's important to better bridge the natural and social sciences, and we think that this approach allows that because of its orientation and recognizing the materiality of these concerns and integrating the natural sciences into our research program. And in that sense, we put this out as like a way to talk to a group of interdisciplinary folks, and that maybe we can facilitate some further discussions and collaborations. So we think it allows for this bridging of the natural and social sciences and provides crucial critical insights into the social conditions and processes that drive ongoing environmental changes and help identify what we think are often underexplored socio-ecological conditions for sustainability transformations. And this is through revealing these structural processes that can advance transformations or possibly impede them. So, as we said, there's rich scientific understanding of how plastics move through and impact aquatic ecological systems and other systems. So, for example, this work that illustrates the numerous and interactive ways that plastics as novel entities are contributing to the overshoot of planetary boundaries. And I believe one of the authors I saw is present at this, so thank you for doing this great work. So this kind of research is foundational for discussing these matters, and we draw on this fundamentally. Nevertheless, we think that there's some gaps in addressing the structural, social structural, in particular political economic drivers of the crisis. And we see these as ultimate drivers underlying these things. So important research has been focusing on these kinds of outcomes and symptoms, and the plastic debris in the ocean is a good example. But we think under examining the social structural processes and forces that continuously expand production and consumption of plastics. So, for example, the role of corporate control and influence, economic imperatives, political, legal arrangements are driving plastic proliferation. We argue that this is rarely interrogated in plastics research. And these are ultimately all social forces. So we're suggesting that without addressing these kinds of social systemic factors, technical solutions such as improved waste management or biodegradable alternatives will be insufficient, as they don't challenge these underlying ultimate drivers, you could say, or structures that ensure plastic production continues and continues to rise. Relatedly, and somewhat controversial maybe, the approach we put forward suggests that the focus on management and governance, for example, treaties, while very important, is, we would say, inadequate, because a deeper integration of what we have called critical sustainability science, we think, is needed to complement this other advancements in sustainability research, moving beyond the dominant pollution management paradigm, for example, or the corporate social responsibility approaches, and tackle these root causes of the plastic crisis. So we're suggesting we need to deeply interrogate social processes such as entrenched production dynamics and imperatives to fully tackle these matters. But however, as we discuss, a critical sustainability science approach will often challenge conventional wisdom and strongly held assumptions in certain realms, for example, the political realm, the economic realm, but even the scientific realm, and to some degree, the powerful actors that are in those realms, particularly the political and economic realms. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Borja to present, and I'll move through, and you just tell me when to move on, okay?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefano. Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me well? I'm just not in the normal setup because some technical issues, but if you cannot hear me well, let me know. So, yeah, as Stefano was very much presenting, like the theoretical and the analytical approach we are taking, just wanted to contextualize a bit here that actually these are very kind of traditional, or if you would say canonical, sustainability science questions, starting up already with the issues of the Great Acceleration, for instance. That although perhaps it's been more of a novel concept coined in the early 2000s with all discussions around the Anthropocene and the rest, and also together with the planetary boundaries framework, it's basically touching upon a quite old debate around the limits to growth and the whole question of the exponential expansion of human activity and its impacts on the Earth systems. No? And this is represented very well with this idea of the Great Acceleration starting in the second half of the 20th century, but also through this kind of shooting upwards curves of socioeconomic and also socio-environmental indicators. And in that regard, Stefano, if you can pass, we draw not only on kind of the observational aspect of this type of work that, as I mentioned, is and also like tracing and modeling where those impacts come from, what do those trajectories come from, what impacts they have, but also kind of sociological and political economic understandings of why that is, why does that happen, why is there this impetus, this imperative of continually growing, and that it's also it's a very rich body of a scholarship that understands that certain features on um, modern economic systems that are driven by the main goal of accumulation, basically of profit making, so that it can be reinvested in producing more production, therefore that for the sake of valorizing in consumption, so that you can become more competitive against your other basically producers, your other competitors in the market, right? So not get crunched in your profit making, so that you can invest and overcome your adversaries, let's say. And that would be like the main um, mechanism between within this treadmill of production, as was called by Scheinberg and others, famous environmental sociologists in the US, who are trying to understand why this was happening, although starting observing the deleterious effects, both socially and environmentally. And here it's interesting to see how these exponential curves in the case of plastics are even more dramatic. No, if you look at these trends that more or less follow around the trajectory of the GDP or the indicator of the GDP, you have other products, other components that are key in expanding economic growth, like cement, aluminium, steel. But plastics is even more the green line, right? It's even growing at a higher pace. And we would argue, as Stefano was mentioning already, that it's not only this drive to constantly expand production and consumption so as to stabilize the economic system, but also in the next slide, we problematize a main approach between the industry that has been also traditionally the main approach in addressing the problem of plastics pollution, which has been basically not focus so much on production or at all in production, but rather mention or focus the solution into put the kind of the weight of the solution to the problem into recycling, right? For instance, if we could see a recent report by the basically kind of the industry lobby in Europe on plastics, which is Plastics Europe. They put out a report last year arguing for solutions to the plastics crisis, and these are the main strategic pillars, right? So make plastic circular, so kind of another way of talking about basically recycling, no, reusing materials. Also decarbonize the plastics value chain, which is something that it's also quite problematic, as you probably all know, that it's along the production and the consumption of the product that there is CO2 emissions as well. And therefore, and in the last part, kind of educate and promote kind of consumer-driven responsibility towards consumer choices and the use of the product. And if just very recent interviews with different parts of the industry that are involved in that discussion still are very much focused on the issue on recycling. Although you're probably very much aware that recycling rates and recycling management problems are very, very grave and have not been getting much better overall. And therefore, that's also we see as a structural problem in not having the willingness, or perhaps being kind of tied, even those perhaps actors in the sector that would like to do something different. They have been pushed on promoting some sort of solutions, although the empirical evidence suggests that they are not so much useful. And that poses a next question for on the next slide, which is usually for this kind of problems, not only plastics, but also in terms of fishing and many other problems that relate to the sea, in which there is kind of a more vague jurisdictional claims, in which there is the diffusion of responsibility because it's difficult to track, or it's difficult even to kind of mm, even bring to trial, bring to the justice whoever commits an environmental or even a crime in terms of labor or human rights. There rises this also traditional idea or kind of very canonical idea in environmental, um, in environmental politics or sustainability science, which is the tragedy of the commodity, basically arguing that the result of such problems is by having this non very defined
The tragedy of the commons. I'll have to
the
correct you.
tragedy.
You said
Sorry,
tragedy of the commodity.
sorry,
That's
sorry.
tragedy of the commons. Okay.
The tragedy of the commons, yes. Not having defined correctly who are the responsibility, both in terms of property and liability, and therefore everyone is acting in the self-interest, and therefore a tragedy happens. And yeah, actually, we are more invested in a different alternative explanation, which is the tragedy of the commodity, which refers to the previous theory as well, which is commodity production and structuring the reproduction of societies, as Stefano was mentioned, as the material basis of our societies by producing commodities and valorizing them, provides this tragedy that you end up producing too much of something that might be profitable, but has deleterious social and environmental impacts. And that we would argue is the case of plastics. And so to start concluding, we think it's important also from a sociological aspect to draw upon these kind of questions. And also, again, referring back and building upon the very key natural science research that has been quite recently and very rigorously talking about that any type of recycling forecasts are not enough, but also to question what are these social goals that we build production systems around, right? And the question of plastics is quite telling. Just this graph is just to show how basically, and we are probably all quite aware, most of the plastic production goes into producing packaging, and most of this packaging, it's single-use plastics, and therefore, and in many times for consumer items, for daily items, and in many times not particularly necessary or not particularly useful in many respects. Although they are, of course, very useful uses of plastics in the medical industry, in technology, in many other aspects that have helped push forward these different sectors, economic sectors, and have provided many social and you could argue even environmental benefits by substituting the uses of other materials. The issue with plastics, of course, is that this growth that you can see in the, again, back on the next slide that we already showed before, this exponential growth has been based upon the production and therefore the disposal of basically single use and not so much necessary plastics to ameliorate human life, let's say. And in that way, which is interesting perhaps to remember of this curve is that actually the steeping up where it changes trajectory dramatically and when it starts to pick up wasn't so long ago, right? In the 70s, in the 60s even, plastics as compared to now were much less pervasive in our daily lives. And therefore this idea that now it's very difficult to think of a life without plastics, so we kind of naturalize this very synthetic product, should make us think, and I think sociological approach would help us think of, okay, why is that happening? No? Why we became so much enmeshed in this plastics realm, whether in the 70s, people, and many of them are still around, and they can tell they were living quite well without plastics, and not only in a subjective manner. If you look at many indicators, at least in industrialized societies, the level of well-being of the material conditions of life were not much different in many respects, and where people were doing fairly better without plastics. So that also brings the question to conclude, which is more of a propositional question, which is the idea of degrowth. That it's also quite a old idea in discussing environmental problems, going back to the Limits to Growth report in the 70s, and where many of these discussions started in the Western world. And basically has picked up as climate and other ecological or crises have been becoming accelerating and becoming worse. This idea of degrowth was basically abandoning growth as the main goal of societal development has becoming taken more and more seriously. So now there is quite serious research in many different aspects of this idea, but basically it's a very simple idea of trying to accommodate economic activity to basically the planetary boundaries in a way that is not by just creating more inequalities, so like in the few resources that we have or the few sink capacities of the Earth system to accommodate the privileges of the few, but basically trying to satisfy the needs of all in a finite planet. That's the kind of a very basic idea of it. So therefore, we are also inspired by this vision in thinking about a way out of the plastics crisis, and also in thinking analytically. So in that sense, it's not only that we want to see what's bad about it, but also how could we think ways out. So just to conclude now, really,
I'm going to go to, yeah.
We argue that critical sustainability science is a necessary approach in that regard, and a very fitting complementary approach to the natural science that's been very rigorously defining and showing what is the problem by uncovering the kind of basal sociostructural and political economy drivers, so that this can also visualize ways of enacting change, both in terms of science, but also in terms of supporting social movements, alternative economic practices, and kind of understanding political change in a more fundamental way, rather than just trying to kind of give assessments to policymakers in the hopes that in these big conventions, then they would have some kind of path-breaking laws or path-breaking deals or treaties that, as we can see, both in the climate crisis, but also in the plastics, as in Busan, past months, are quite difficult to do and quite unsuccessful. So that would be it. Maybe, Stefano, if you want to add something as a conclusion, and then maybe we can jump on the discussion.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, we've been going on for a little while. Maybe they want to have some discussion, but yeah, we could talk about these things some more. So maybe I'll stop sharing and conclude there.